Next, we will hear from Dr. Anthony Ingraffea, the Dwight C. Baum Professor in Engineering at Cornell University. He will speak about well engineering and health. Please welcome Dr. Ingraffea. Is yours on here? Right there? Or do you want to go ahead? Sure.
Good morning. I'd also like to start by thanking the League of Women Voters and especially Betty for arranging this wonderful opportunity to interact with you today. I also want to thank the previous speakers for somewhat setting the table, giving the broad brushstrokes as well as some technical details on various aspects of the interaction between shale gas development and human health. This talk is going to be a little bit more focused. If I can use the phrase, we're going to drill down deeply. Just checking your sense of humor here. You also note that my co-author on this talk, his last name is Wells. He couldn't help it. But I'm going to be talking about a very specific aspect of shale gas development which can lead to human health effects, and that's this issue of leaking wells. It was briefly alluded to by Bernie's talk and also by Robert. So I'm going to have to explain some of the industry terminology. The title is Wellbore integrity. That doesn't mean anything to anybody in the room. Wellbore integrity is the phrase that the industry uses to describe whether a well, a hole in the ground, steel casing, and cement, whether that design has been executed as planned and whether it continues to function as designed. If it doesn't, the well has lost its integrity. Another one of those fancy words in oil and gas stuff. But the issue in particular, here we go, is there's a myth. Bernie talked about obfuscation. I use the word mythology. It's a polite way of saying they lie. The myth is that the methane that's being discovered more frequently in people's private water wells, and as Bernie pointed out, if it's methane, that's a precursor to other things. The methane in private water wells, it was always there. We didn't do it. Obviously, our commercials show that there are 4 or more layers of steel casing, each of which has a cement gasket behind it, so our wells don't leak. I'm going to try to convince you that there's an alternate reality, a truth, and that is that leaking gas wells are a chronic problem. Those of you who are health professionals know what chronic means. I've had a chronic back pain for 30 years. It's a chronic problem. It's ubiquitous. That means it happens everywhere. Gulf of Mexico, Pennsylvania, North Dakota, offshore wells, onshore wells, gas wells, oil wells, water wells, wherever you punch a hole in the ground and you try to create a structure of a hole in the ground, steel casing and cement, they leak. And it's a well understood problem because the industry has been trying to solve the problem for over 100 years, and it can't, not completely. So the key issue is, given that wells will leak, how often do they leak? And what relationship exists between the spatial intensity of leaking gas wells and the spatial intensities of people's private water wells? Again, renaming the question often leads to a better answer. So I would also point out that the reality is that this problem is completely unresponsive to tough regulations. Every state in the country that has shale gas drilling now claims to have the toughest regulations, including Pennsylvania. But I'll try to show you that this problem is continuing to cause and will continue to cause loss of access to private drinking water wells. All right, bingo. Obviously, leaking wells can pose a problem to underground sources of drinking water. It can also pose local air quality problems, and ultimately, it also affects climate change. There's no time this morning to get into all 3 of these, so I'm going to focus on only the first one. What might a leaking well look like? So here's my only video of today. I hope you can see it clearly. I'm going to use the pointer here because I'm not sure that I can I do this? No, doesn't work. I have to use the pointer. Be patient with me. Oh, it did? Okay, so this is the wellhead. You're standing looking at where the well comes out of the ground. That's the production casing, the steel pipe that's supposed to be transporting natural gas and other natural gas liquids to the surface. That's the only place that these hydrocarbons are supposed to appear at the surface, inside that steel pipe. So the video I'm going to show you now shows that in this particular well, which happens to be a Dimmick well, hope you can see it, it looks like your hot tub. There's bubbling occurring in the cellar. Those of you who have cellars in our homes, if you ever had bubbling in your cellar, you got a problem. The industry has problems with bubbling in their cellars. So this very rapid gaseous emission is methane and other hydrocarbon gases coming up outside of the production casing. This is an example of a well that's leaking. It's not the only kind of way that one can find out whether a well is leaking, but it is a way. There's your wellhead, so you got oriented. Problem now, the question to ask, if I can get this video to stop. I guess I can't. This is not my laptop, I'm not used to it. There. A leaking well can emit methane. You're seeing it. It can go directly into the atmosphere. You're seeing it. It becomes a possible precursor to ozone formation and local air pollution, and goes into the atmosphere as a very, very potent greenhouse gas and contributes to climate change. While it's on its way to the surface, outside the production casing where it's safely being transported, but outside the production casing where it's not being safely transported, it can come into contact with underground sources of drinking water, your drinking water well. So what do we need to know? We need to know the relationship, the spatial relationship and temporal relationship among the frequency with which wells fail and the nearby water wells. Now, an aspect of shale gas development that you all know well is that it's spatially intense. It's impossible to economically develop gas from a shale formation without drilling 8 to 10 wells per square mile. I hope you heard that. 8 to 10 wells per square mile. Pennsylvania currently has about 6,800 shale gas wells out of an expected 100,000. So things haven't really started in Pennsylvania yet. One of the slides you saw earlier this morning about that crazy study about cancer. Well, we've only had 6,800 wells and we got 100,000 expected. What can we expect to see at this point? Well, we can see the tip of the iceberg. But the whole idea here is you got to drill a hell of a lot of wells. So there's going to be intense spatial intensity. It's not the number of pads, it's the number of holes you punch in the ground. That's the number of wells. So if each of these pads, you can see 4 of them in this diagram, each of those pads is going to have 6, 8, 10, 12, 20 wells. It's a lot of holes. And every time you punch a hole, you offer an opportunity for that hole to leak. Has to be properly gasketed. And we're not worried about casing leaks. Casing is steel pipe. It very rarely fails. It does, but much more rarely than the cement. The cement is the gasket, the sealant. So we know that shale gas development is spatially intense. Here's an example of what one county in Pennsylvania currently looks like. This is Bradford County, New York-Pennsylvania line right up here. This is utopia, this is hell. That's the people in Bradford County. The colors here indicate the different operators that are currently operating in Bradford County. You can see that the county is about half developed in terms of lease, but not even 1/10 of the way developed in terms of the number of holes in the ground. You'll notice that all of these operational units look like little rectangles, roughly a square mile each. They're all oriented north-northwest, south-southeast. That's because of the geology. That's the way it works. We also know that we're beginning to see water well impacts. So thanks to our friends at Frac Tracker, who are now putting another public service on their website, we can begin to see the evidence with our own eyes of incidents of well water contamination. So there's the zoomed out US version. Here's the zoomed in. Let's go back one here. How do I go back? There. There's Pennsylvania. All the blue dots are incidents of well water contamination reported to the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, which has determined as of a year ago, that 161 private water wells had in fact been contaminated, not by fracking, like Bernie pointed out, I try not to use that word. Not by fracking, but merely by the fact that they drilled wells. Okay. 161 confirmed cases, 6,000 wells. I'll help you project forward in a few minutes what that means for our future. One specific case of extreme spatial intensity of drilling and concomitant loss of a large number of water wells is the famous Dimmock debacle. For those of you who don't know, eventually the PADEP declared a 9 square mile affected area. I would have called it infected. But those were the 9 square miles in which there were 63 wells on about 30 pads. The pads are the red dots. 63 wells and 30 pads drilled in about 9 months. That was a rapid spool up by a company that didn't know what the hell it was doing back in 2008, 2009. And accordingly, 13 families lost access. 13 families admitted, of all the families in that area, admitted to losing access to their water wells. So this is not fiction. It happens. We also know by our colleagues' research from Duke University that there is an established spatial correlation between distance. The horizontal axis here is distance between a water well and the nearest gas well. And the vertical axis is the measured concentration of methane in the water well. And what you're seeing here is a very strong correlation. The closer a water well is to the nearest gas well, the higher the concentration of measured methane in that water well. That's a correlation, it's not causality. We can't directly relate the concentration of methane in any one water well to methane coming out of any one leaking gas well. But this is obviously something that has to be followed up, and that's what we're doing at Cornell. The people that did that study are not geologists, they're not petroleum engineers, so they conjectured, gee, why might this methane be getting into water wells? And not knowing any better, they conjectured maybe one of the reasons is that the gas wells are leaking. Seems reasonable. And that's what we're following up on, trying to give some factual or at least statistical basis for that conjecture. So like all good scientists, we start a research project, which I'm about to describe to you in the public for only the second time. First time was yesterday. A project that we've been working on for 2 years. First thing we did was did a literature survey. What do we know about leaking wells? What does the industry know about leaking wells? What do regulators know about leaking wells? And what do you, the public, know about leaking wells? Well, the industry knows a hell of a lot. We would hope the regulators know at least as much, and I suspect that the public knows virtually nothing. That's why I'm here today. So earlier this year, I participated in a webinar sponsored by the Society of Petroleum Engineers, SPE. I'm a member. And the title of the webinar was Wellbore Integrity. You know what that means. So clearly the industry can't be saying there isn't a problem, otherwise they wouldn't be having workshops on the problem. And during this webinar, I was just caught up by this one slide which says this particular guy had gone off and looked at 1.8 million wells around the world and found out that 35% of them were leaking. I'll let that sink in for a minute. Sustained casing pressure is another acronym, another name. Loss of wellbore integrity, sustained casing pressure, sustained casing vent flow, annular flow, loss of zonal isolation. It's all obfuscation. What they mean is the damn well is leaking. All right, well, 35% leaking. Go to the literature, the industry literature, which, by the way, is not peer-reviewed, but it is what the industry tells itself and tells each other. This is a bar graph that shows the rate at which wells leak as a function of well age in the Gulf of Mexico, about 4,000 wells. It's pretty easy to notice that brand new wells, young ones, less than a year old, leak at the rate of 1 out of every 20. And as the wells age, the leak rate goes up. Those of us over 39 know what that means. There is a sense of humor here. Okay, well, though the industry criticizes me a lot for everything I say, and even my jokes I get criticized for, but probably because I'm very poor at humor. So they said, well, those are offshore oil and gas wells. They're not shale gas wells. Some of them are 30 and 40 years old. You can't expect that to reflect modern shale gas development in a state which has really tough regulations in which there's a wide variety of operators using the best available cement, best available technology, the smartest people, and they're taking their time and doing right by you. Okay, fine. So I went and found some more of the industry data. This is from 2009. This is 340,000 gas wells onshore in Canada. Then I get criticized because they're Canadian wells. Let me tell you right now, I would much rather have you, the people of Pennsylvania, be operating under the regulations of British Columbia than the regulations of Pennsylvania. Having said that, this paper points out very similar things. Let's see, new wells, if you can see, new wells fail somewhere around 5%, and as the wells age, the failure rate goes up. And this particular paper began to study modern shale gas development by looking at wells that were deviated. That's another one of those fancy oil and gas words that has sexual connotations. It's all guys. So a deviated well is one that's not vertical. And as you know, all production shale gas wells are directionally drilled. They're deviated. And so sustained casing vent flow, gas migration, in the particular area where they studied only deviated wells, they found that about 65% of them were leaking. It's much more difficult to put a gasket in a deviated well than it is in a straight well. But once again, I'm criticized. Those aren't wells that are representative of modern practice in a state which has very tough regulations. So a little bit more industry data. This is out of a website of a consultant to the industry whose job it is to go out and fix leaking wells. But then he writes papers that say that wells don't leak. But this is data from his website. And what do you notice? Have you seen the shape of these curves before? You see young wells, somewhere around 5%. And as the wells age, failure rate goes up to 25, 30, 40%. Familiar theme. And finally, we went to the most principal source of information absorbed by regulators nowadays in Ohio. That's the other state. Let's see, there's utopia, there's hell, and there's near hell. So Ohio is following in your lead, and they're all going to get rich. And so the front page of the Columbus Dispatch on August 8, 2013 announced that gas leaks from shale wells are rare. We decided not to use that as a peer-reviewed reference. So we decided to do our own study. And we accepted the criticisms of our use of industry data to explain that you should be expecting wells to leak. And we went to a state where there is modern shale gas development, a state which claims to have the toughest regulations in the country, Pennsylvania. And we went to the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection database, which is online, hiding in plain sight. Anybody can go look at it. And we created our own database by extracting gigabytes of information from that database, which included information on all 41,381 oil and gas wells drilled in the state of Pennsylvania during a 13-year period ending on December 31st, 2012. Unconventional, conventional, oil and gas, all 41,381 wells, and 75,000 inspection documents for those wells. It's a lot of information. So we gathered all that information. It's called the Well Database, and we began to try to get understanding out of it. Draw data in the form of Excel spreadsheets, columns, rows, entries. And what we found out when we went through it is that of those 41,381 wells, there were 8,700 wells that had no inspection reports. 1 out of every 5 wells in the database didn't have an inspection report. Now, that either means the well was never inspected, or it means the inspection reports aren't in the database. So we lost a fifth of the database right off the bat. Not our fault. We also found out that of the 5,223 wells for which there were inspection reports, the inspection reports were dated before the wells were drilled. Well, how do you do that? Well, obviously, there are entry errors. So we don't know how to correct entry errors. We don't know which date was right, which date was wrong. So the only thing we can do as researchers is throw that data out. So then we were left with 27,000 wells, but with 75,000 inspection documents. Still a very substantial statistical base from which to derive information about past performance and predict what's going to happen in the future. Second thing we did was to mine the data, try to figure out relationships that weren't readily apparent by just looking at reams and reams of numbers. There's software to do that. So we used very, very modern software to try to find connections, relationships, and correlations among all the data entries. So for example, we wanted to know how many wells had received violations for leaking. It's against the law in Pennsylvania for a well to leak. So you would naturally expect that an inspector that goes to a well who sees a leak, like the video I showed you, would immediately issue a violation. Silly us. That didn't turn out to be the case. We found many cases where a inspector would go, see a well was leaking, write comments into the comment sheet and say, this well is leaking. Some extreme cases, this well is leaking so badly, the pad should be evacuated immediately. No violation. Watch me. Wink. Nod. I hope the next time you get stopped on the Pennsylvania Turnpike for speeding, you can do wink and nod and not get a violation. Okay, so then that caused us to not only have to look at whether violations were issued, we had to read all the comments and all 75,000 inspection reports to find out whether an inspector had seen or detected that a well was leaking, but had not issued a violation. And this was all done through software, using word searches on keywords. But that's not foolproof, so then we had to go back and make sure that what the computer claimed it had found as an evidence of a well leaking was in fact evidenced by reading all those comments. Takes a while. And I thank Renee Santoro for doing all that work. So here's what we found for the wells that had been issued violations. Here are the various violation codes in the Chapter 78 regulations of PADEP. These are all the ways that a well could have been issued a violation for leaking. There's not just one thing. It says if your well leaks, you get a violation. There are many ways a well can be cited for leaking. And what we found is that the most common of these violations was that the well was leaking, the operator knew it, and didn't tell anybody. Pennsylvania law says if an operator determines that its well is leaking, it has 24 hours to tell the PADEP. So that means that many of these wells could have been leaking for 25 hours, 25 days, 25 months, until the next inspector came around. There are no set inspection schedules. As you'll see later, some wells haven't been inspected in 10 years. So that was the most common. There are a lot of others, but the red numbers indicate how often we found in the database these violations that were found and issued. But as I said, many times there were no violations. So we had to do keyword searches. And the most common thing we found was, I think it's this one right here, if I can see it. We found comments issued by inspectors that said, there's bubbling in the cellar. That's what you saw in the video. No violation. I'm going to skip all the big tables and numbers and get to the meat of the matter. So once we had figured out which data was reliable, and once we had figured out which wells had in fact been leaking, either by having received violations or by comments from the inspectors saying the well is leaking, the next thing we wanted to do is extract relational information and see patterns. And to do that, again, we used a modern probabilistic statistical technique called the Cox proportional hazard model. Anybody use it this morning? Anybody a statistician? Oh man, I can say anything about this, right? No, I'm not. I am not a statistician. So we went to Cornell University. I am at Cornell University. We went to Marty Wells, who happens to be the premier probabilist statistician at Cornell University. Been a colleague of mine for 20 years. And we said, Marty, can you help us understand this data? Extract information and knowledge from it. He said, yeah, we should be using the Cox proportional hazard model. It's well known. It's well known in the medical literature, as it turns out. It's not one-off. It's not freaky. It's commonly used, and I didn't know anything about it, so Marty joined the team. And here's what the model can do without all the technical details. It can tell us the risk of cement and or casing failures for a well, even though we have incomplete inspection information from that well based on performance of other wells. Now, what is a complete inspection record for a well? Let's make sure we understand each other here. What is a complete inspection record for a well in time? How long would it have to be? Answer the question, I'm not going to go on. How long would we have to inspect a well in order for us to have a complete inspection record? Forever. How many wells, are there any wells on the face of the earth for which we have complete inspection records? No. Therefore, if we want to predict the future, what's the only thing we have to go on? The inspection records from the previous years. And what this model does is it allows us to extrapolate into the future with a statistically valid, testable manner. It allows us to tell us the uncertainty in our prediction. What is likely to happen for a well in any class, given information about that well's history and similar wells' past history. Got it? Good. All right, so here we go. I'm getting to the meat of the matter. And I have to warn you that the data I'm about to give you, the information I'm about to give you, the interpretation I'm about to give you is not yet peer-reviewed. We have written this paper. The paper is about to be submitted to a prestigious peer-reviewed journal. Please don't quote this to anybody, and when they're making the video of this, we're going to have to black out these slides because I don't want people to misinterpret anything I'm saying. So I'm going to show you 4 or 5 documents, each of which is a graph. The horizontal axis in each case is going to be what we call analysis time in weeks. That's the amount of time that we want to use as a projection. For any well, we start looking at it the day it was drilled, and we stop looking at it if, in fact, that well has never received an inspection, or all the inspections to date on that well have never revealed that the well is leaking. Otherwise, it continues into the data. The vertical axis is the fractional probability of a well leaking. It's the failure rate. Fractional probability, 10% probability, 20% probability, 30% probability, etc. The first thing that this Cox proportional hazard model blared at us, shouted at us, is, wow, there are some relationships here. There are some very peculiar relationships. For example, if we look at all the wells that remained in our database, 25,000 of them, took all the data, conventional, unconventional, oil and gas, and we asked the simple question, is there a difference between the probability of failure for wells drilled before 2009 and wells drilled after 2009? The answer is resoundingly yes. I don't know if you can see the colors, but this is the probability of failure. If you wait 640 weeks, what would be the expected probability of failure of all wells that were drilled before 2009? Somewhere around 3%. That's bad enough. But if you were only to wait for about 180 weeks and looked at only wells that were drilled since 2009, the expected probability would be about 38%. What kind of wells were drilled after 2009 in Pennsylvania? Thank you, unconventional shale gas wells. So automatically, right away, we saw there's a big difference in performance, past performance and predicted future performance between conventional and unconventional wells. Next graph, we said, okay, let's just look at the data from before 2009. That's mostly conventional wells, non-shale gas wells, but about a few hundred shale gas wells by 2009. And again, what we see is we're looking at unconventional wells, mostly here, somewhere between 2 and 3% failure. And if we look at the entire state and just ask for all the shale gas wells that were drilled before 2009, 300 or so of them, what would we expect 8 years into the future? We'd expect about 13% of those to be leaking. Not an insignificant number. Then we looked at all the new wells. Remember, the industry criticism of our work had been we weren't looking at shale gas wells, we weren't looking at modern shale gas wells, we weren't looking at a place where there's really tough regulations, and we weren't looking at a place where really good companies are drilling a lot of wells. Well, now we are, here, Pennsylvania. And now if we say, let's look at all the unconventional wells that have been drilled since 2009, and we extrapolate out to about 4 years, that's the blue curve, all the shale gas wells that have been drilled modern era, 2009, you've had an opportunity to update the regulations by then in Pennsylvania. Modern shale gas wells in a toughly regulated state, modern technology, modern cement, modern techniques, best people. We extrapolate and say, all those wells, 13% will be leaking by 4 years. Then we noticed something else, or the Cox proportional hazard model told us something else. There's a huge difference between wells in northeastern Pennsylvania and the rest of the state. We wouldn't have seen that with the naked eye. A lot of numbers. But it was very easy for us to break out these counties: Bradford, Cameron, Clinton, Wyoming, Lycoming, Potter, Sullivan, Susquehanna, Tioga, Wayne, and Wyoming. Those are the northeastern counties where there's dry gas development. And we did this analysis and looked at all the wells that were in those northeastern counties versus wells that were not in the northeastern counties. And shockingly, we find out that the wells in the northeastern counties would, after 8 years, be failing at the rate of about 53%. Poor people in Dimmock don't know what hit them yet. That 9 square miles with 63 wells, wait till you see what it looks like with 630 wells. That nightmare is going to start over again, and it's going to continue forever, my opinion. The last graph I'm going to show you is the one that I like to throw in the face of companies like EQT and Chevron and XTO, because this graph says that the best possible, let me put it this way, your best effort is worse than your worst effort. Many companies now admit that Pennsylvania was not their finest hour in those early years of shale gas, 2007, 2008, 2009. You know, those guys had just come up from Oklahoma and Texas. They'd never seen a winter. They'd never seen a hill. They didn't know they had to wear gloves, and it was 10 degrees below zero, and it's 24/7, and they still had to go out there and drill and frack. And they made a lot of mistakes. Presidents of corporations have said that in public. It's not our finest hour, but we've learned. Well, no. The red, those are the wells that were drilled past 2009. And for any amount of time that you want to let go by, they're going to be failing at a higher rate than the wells that were drilled before 2009. Now, a lot of questions remain. We look at this, you mine a database, you extract information, and now you want to start hypothesizing explanations. Why are we seeing things like a big difference between pre-2009, post-2009? Why is there a big difference between conventional and unconventional? Why is there a big difference between northeastern Pennsylvania and the rest of the state? We have to explain those differences. And this is the paper that will start asking those questions. And the answers have to come from the industry and from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. So we're going to be looking for a response to this paper with answers coming from those sources. So let me conclude. How much time do I have? Oh, good. I'm not going to conclude quite yet. Let me summarize what you just saw. Never tell a professor to shut up before he has to. No, I'll leave time for questions. So we have some preliminary insights into those questions I just asked. Why is it that the pre-2009 wells aren't failing at a rate similar to the post-2009 wells? Well, I asked the question the wrong way. How do we know they're not failing? They're not being inspected anymore. Yeah, because we have the inspection records, and the inspection records have dates. Those wells that were drilled in 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, they're not being inspected anymore. Well, why not? DEP is overloaded. Those are really good people doing really hard work for very meager pay in very trying conditions, and they can't keep up with the pace. So they're constantly being challenged to look at those shale gas wells. We're looking at the shale gas wells, they're no longer looking at the conventional wells. So it's incorrect for us to conclude from our analysis that the older wells aren't failing at a higher rate. We can conclude that they're not being inspected, therefore we don't know if they're failing at a higher rate. Uh-oh. Yeah, all the information And all the data I've shown you can't be any better than the information that was put into the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection database. Garbage in, garbage out. I already told you that we don't know anything about 8,000 wells, and 5,000 of those well records are useless. But if an inspector goes to a well and just checks off the boxes, the inspection report has check boxes, and then it has a comment field, has a violation field and a comment field. If the inspector never says a word other than inspected the well, here's the inspection date, and nothing else, there's no information. We can't conclude from an inspection report, which doesn't say anything, that nothing was there. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Doctors know that, right? So since we know, we read all these inspection reports, we know the names of the inspectors, we know that there are inspectors who never write a word. Never. On any inspection they've ever done, never wrote a word. We know that there are some inspectors who are so diligent and assiduous, I'd like to have them as graduate students, they write essays. So this information can't be any better than the information that's in the database. And the database right now is incomplete. In some cases, it's error prone, and in other cases, the information just isn't there for which we can make, draw conclusions or even observations. We can declare with statistical accuracy that 24% of the conventional wells and 4% of the unconventional wells that have been drilled have never received inspections, or those inspections are lost. We can also conclude, based on this predictive model, that if you're living in those northeastern counties, the probability of a gas well starting to leak and potentially having an impact on your water well is 12 times higher than if you don't live in those states. As Bernie pointed out, luck of the draw. You could just be unlucky enough to be living there. Which still leaves open the question, why those counties? Is it because there was a heck of a lot of drilling going on in a very short period of time early on? Is it because those are the counties that have the most wells and the highest spatial intensity so far? Is it because the geology up there is much more confused than the geology in the southwest? Or is it because up there, most of the people live in trailers and not in McMansions? And finally, about this Cox proportional hazard model, if you're living anywhere in Pennsylvania right now, we are very confident that we can say that at least 13% of all the oil and gas wells drilled statewide since 2009 will experience leakage. At least 13%, for reasons I just pointed out. In some areas, much higher, but at least 13. And if we're going to have 100,000 shale gas wells in Pennsylvania and the Marcellus alone, that's 13,000 leaking wells. The science we have yet to finish is the hydrogeological connection. If I got 13,000 leaking wells, how many water wells are going to be contaminated? Simple ratio says if we have 161 confirmed cases after 6,800 wells, multiply 6,800 by 16, multiply 161 by 16, we're going to have something like 2,000 contaminated water wells, at least. At least 45% of the unconventional wells drilled in the northeastern counties since 2009 will experience leakage. And post-2009 unconventional wells in the northeastern counties will experience a higher rate of failure than older wells in that region. So that's the message for today. It's not a direct answer to health impact. It's an indirect answer because there has to be a source. The source is the leaking wells. The pathway is underground. The exposure is drinking the water, bathing the water. So I have to continue to work with hydrogeologists. I have to continue to work with physicians to get the chain of evidence complete. Leaking gas well, health effect. So thank you very much for your attention this morning. Look forward to questions.
I have tons of questions. I hope you can stay because obviously we can't answer all of them. Let's start with one that says that shallow fracking is now occurring in Pennsylvania, in Westmoreland County specifically. So now these are not the horizontal wells. So how worried should we be about shallow well fracking?
With respect to what I reported today, it doesn't make a damn difference whether it's shallow or deep. It doesn't make any difference whether it's a gas well or an oil well. It doesn't make any difference whether it's a Marcellus well, a Utica well, or any well. It's a hole in the ground. So in that case, you should be just as concerned from the point of view of leaking wells as if you were seeing wells that were deeper. That's different. That's a different question than saying, if I'm drilling a shallow well, is it more probable that fracking fluid, it's the first time I've used that word, right? Fracking fluid can get into my underground source of drinking water? Absolutely, because you have less natural barrier between the level where you're doing the fracking and the level where you have fresh water. But those are two separate issues. Everything I talked about today has absolutely nothing to do with fracking, other than the fact they're drilling the well so they can frack it.
There was an earthquake in Ohio a few days ago, apparently. Has the shale industry had anything to say about what earthquakes could do to their cement casings?
I am not aware of any public statement, a report, or paper directly from the oil and gas industry about their concerns for human-induced seismicity. Self-induced seismicity is what it is. But there are others who have expressed concerns. So let me make sure everybody understands. Seismicity induced by oil and gas development can be of two forms. It can either be induced by the fracking process itself, and that is now confirmed in 3 places on the face of the earth: Great Britain, Oklahoma, British Columbia. That is, the fracking process itself triggered significant earthquakes. Or it can be triggered by waste disposal. And I suspect that the Ohio incidents were of the latter type. If you're on the surface, do you care whether it was caused by fracking or a waste injection? No. If you're on the surface and like people in Oklahoma who had severe damage to their homes from a 5.3 earthquake in Oklahoma, it's a concern. So is the industry going to have to react to this problem? Yes. Is the problem going to become more prevalent? Yes. Why? Because we expect 1 million shale gas wells in the U.S. over the next 20 or 30 years. And that's a lot of fracking, and that's a lot of waste injection.
On your chart of the Northeast versus the rest of Pennsylvania, should we infer that southwestern Pennsylvania wells leak at a lower rate, at a much lower rate, and how much lower?
Yes, that would be a reasonable inference from our statistical analysis. We would expect wells drilled in southwestern Pennsylvania to experience a failure rate after about beginning at 4 years at 13%. By 4 years, about 13% will be leaking. Thereafter, the leak rate will continue to rise. So I hope you don't misinterpret. It's easy to misinterpret what I said. I can misinterpret what I'm saying. Everything has to do with time and space, where you are and how long you're willing to wait. So what we're saying is that the people in northeastern Pennsylvania are going to see more leaking wells earlier than people in southwestern Pennsylvania. But everybody's going to be seeing leaking wells, and in southwestern Pennsylvania we're saying somewhere around 13% within about 4 years. So don't go away thinking everything's fine in southwestern Pennsylvania.